going toward the deli. Get on the ground. Taser. I got him.
Stop resisting.
He's bleeding. Are you bleeding, sir? Yeah, you're bleeding.
Back. Stop resisting. You understand?
She barely had words before the bullets rang out. Take your hand off the gun, but you have to pull my pants down. Her whispered demand, raw and desperate, lingers in the dark. Within seconds, Sergeant Cheryl Clark's service weapon spat fire 8 times into the body of Cleve Lambert. He staggered. Blood bloomed on asphalt under a flickering streetlight, and just like that, a secret love affair, hidden behind badges and uniforms, erupted into a killing. Now rewind. At dawn on the 30th of January 2023, Atlanta awoke to a chill. But in the quiet corners of East Atlanta, something darker was stirring. Cheryl Lashai Clark, a decorated 15-year veteran of the MARTA police force, kissed her family goodbye. She logged on, checked her schedule for night shift at 5 Point Station, a transfer she'd requested months earlier. The busiest, deadliest beat in the transit system. She told colleagues she wanted the challenge. But inside, another motive would soon shake everything we thought we knew. Meanwhile, Cleve Lambert, 38, recently released, carried his belongings in a clear plastic bag as he stepped out of Georgia State Prison. Debt paid, sentence served. He moved into his sister's apartment, intent on building a new life. Each morning, he caught the MARTA train downtown, handing out job applications. Day after day, he faced rejection, background checks, "We'll call you," closed doors. He landed dishwashing work at a tiny restaurant near Peachtree. It was minimum wage, but honest. He sent money to his mother in Augusta. Slowly, inch by inch, he was clawing his way back into normalcy. What nobody outside their circle suspected. Cleve had begun taking circuitous routes home, adding 20 minutes to avoid the 5 Points terminal. To his sister, he said the crowds made him nervous, but the real reason was far more personal, because somewhere, in uniformed hallways and behind closed doors, Cheryl and Cleve's worlds had collided. Two people with secrets, willing to risk everything. They kept meetings clandestine. They whispered in shadows. They built a kind of intimacy born of need. But even in forbidden love, power is a dangerous drug, especially when one wielded a badge. By October 2022, Cheryl asked to transfer to the night shift at 5 Points, the heart of MARTA's complexity and chaos. She told friends she wanted a bigger role. Others say she wanted proximity to him. Thousands pass through 5 Points daily. Drug deals, assaults, the ambiguous interplay between safety and menace. But Cheryl already stood at its center, in uniform, with influence. As the winter deepened, their relationship faltered. He wanted boundaries. She demanded more. He refused one night. And that refusal so intimate, would cost Cleve nearly everything. So on that January evening, Cheryl's patrol car sat idle just outside the station parking lot. Around 9:06 p.m., she radioed dispatch. Quiet. No alarms, no trouble. But she wasn't there on patrol. She was waiting. At 9:15 p.m., a Honda Civic glided into the lot. Its passenger door flung open. Clem Lambert emerged, hands visible, empty. He walked across the cracked pavement toward the shadowed figure in Cheryl's line of sight. The broken streetlight flickered overhead. He didn't notice she'd told him exactly where to park. What he didn't know, the gun in her holster counted 17 rounds. 8 of those she was ready to send his way. In the stillness came a torrent. Their argument, raw and intimate, spilled into violence. He struck her. She fell. He dragged her across the ground, grabbing for her service weapon even while it remained in the holster. Something snapped. Fear, rage. Desperate love turned lethal. She fired. 8 shots. 2 hit near Cleve's feet as he turned. 3 struck as he pivoted away. The final 3 found his back as he ran, struck from above, from a standing shooter. By the time officers arrived, he had buckled the ignition. The Civic lurched out, wounded but mobile. A wounded Cleve crashed on Decatur near Bell Street, then collapsed. He was arrested at the scene. She was bruised and cut, transported to the same hospital. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over standard protocol in any officer-involved shooting. But from the outset, glaring questions shadowed every step. How does a man with empty hands get shot 8 times? How does a seasoned officer, trained to protect, aim for the back of someone fleeing? Ballistics would tell a fragmented truth. The first 2 rounds struck the ground in front of his feet. The middle 3 hit him in motion. The last 3 entered downward, as he staggered or crouched. The angles suggest he was never standing tall, confronting her. Then body cameras or their absence deepened the mystery. MARTA policy demanded activation during any citizen contact, especially when force is involved. But investigators couldn't find footage. Cheryl's camera, reportedly on, had no usable record. What was recorded? What was deleted? Questions multiply like shadows in that night's cold light, and behind her badge lay a pattern. 3 prior complaints. 2 alleged use of excessive force. 1 claimed harassment of an ex-boyfriend in 2019. All were closed, without disciplinary action. Within days, prosecutors made a choice. They charged Cleve Lambert with aggravated assault on an officer, battery, and attempting to disarm her. Maximum sentence: 20 years. But Cheryl Clark, the woman who pulled the trigger, faced no charges. The district attorney claimed evidence failed to prove unlawful use of force beyond reasonable doubt. Her defense: she feared for her life. MARTA suspended Cheryl on paid leave, $68,000 a year, for over a year. Then in March 2024, she was terminated. The official reason: violation of department policy. But which policy? That, they wouldn't say. Cleve survived, but his body bore the legacy. Left partial paralysis in his left arm, chronic pain. Medical bills past $400,000. Bond set at $200,000. Yet he remains in custody, awaiting trial. But the heart of this case is not simply bullets or broken bodies. It's the moral collision. How one person's vulnerability becomes another's justification. How authority can mask intimacy. How desire can turn into a weapon. Tonight, we pause at that crossroads. You're left with the image of 8 bullets, a wounded man, and a woman who held a badge and a gun. Who was the aggressor? Who was the victim? And when an officer appropriates intimacy for violence, where does accountability begin? There's so much more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part. When the bullets stopped echoing in the cold January night, silence swallowed the MARTA station parking lot. But the story of Sergeant Cheryl Clark and Cleve Lambert was only beginning to unfold, and it would stretch far beyond that asphalt stained with blood. To the public, It looked simple. An officer under attack defended herself. To those who knew the truth, or who cared to dig deeper, what happened was more complicated, more insidious, and more humanly tragic than the official reports could ever capture. Cleve's life did not begin or end with that January night. He was born and raised in Augusta, Georgia, the youngest of 3 children. His mother worked as a nursing aide, often taking double shifts to keep the family afloat. His father disappeared when Cleve was only 6 years old, leaving behind little more than a name and a hollow ache. Growing up without a father in a city that often devoured young men whole, Cleve slipped into bad choices, petty theft, street fights, the kind of trouble that never makes headlines until it snowballs into something bigger. By his late 20s, his record was stained with charges that earned him years inside Georgia State Prison. But prison changed him. Behind those walls, he spent long nights staring at ceilings, thinking about wasted time and who he wanted to become. He dreamed of building a life where he could provide for his family, where he could walk without being shadowed by his past. When the gates finally opened, he swore he would never go back. Cheryl Lashai Clark, meanwhile, lived a life that seemed the polar opposite. 15 years in uniform, she wore her badge like armor. To colleagues, she was sharp, disciplined, even ambitious. Commendations filled her personnel file. She had survived the dangerous gauntlet of transit policing, patrolling crowded stations filled with desperation and violence. Her career had given her stability, respect, and authority. But beneath the surface, the story was less polished. She carried a reputation for intensity that sometimes bled into aggression. Whispered rumors about her personal life floated through the department. Failed relationships, complaints that vanished into internal files. She had power, but it wasn't always clean. Somewhere along the way, Cleve and Cheryl crossed paths. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps fate, perhaps inevitability. A man trying to rebuild his life and a woman living in the shadow of authority found something in each other that the outside world could never condone. Their relationship was secret, charged, forbidden. For Cleve, she represented stability, someone who saw more than the ex-convict label stamped across his forehead. For Cheryl, he was an escape from the rigid discipline of police culture, a hidden space where vulnerability was allowed. But secrecy has a cost, and theirs would prove catastrophic. At first, it was tender. She helped him navigate job searches, sometimes slipping him small amounts of money when the dishwashing paychecks didn't stretch far enough. He listened to her frustrations about work, about colleagues who doubted her, about the relentless grind of night shifts. They built a world in shadows, a private language carved out of stolen hours. Yet the imbalance was always there. She carried a gun, a badge, a steady paycheck, a respected position. He carried a record, a fragile second chance, and the fear of slipping back into a system that had already consumed a decade of his life. By late 2022, the cracks showed. Cheryl wanted more intimacy, more control, more proof that Cleve was hers. He began pulling back, frustrated by her intensity, wary of her volatility. Arguments grew louder. Friends noticed he became jumpier, more cautious, taking longer routes home to avoid seeing her unexpectedly. Still, he kept answering her calls, kept meeting her when she demanded, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of some stubborn belief that he could manage her moods. The night of January 30th was supposed to be about money. She owed him $1,000, a debt from promises made during their clandestine months. He believed he was coming to collect it. What he didn't know was that she had already decided how the night would end. Sitting alone in her patrol car, she watched his Civic pull in. She had told him exactly where to park, under the broken light, where shadows swallowed witnesses. As he stepped out, his hands empty, his walk hesitant but calm, she adjusted her Glock in the holster. The stage was set, but the script was twisted. What happened in those next moments became the subject of dueling narratives. Cheryl's version painted her as the target of sudden violence. He struck her, dragged her, reached for her weapon, leaving her no choice but to fire. But ballistics revealed a different rhythm. Shots first at the ground, then into his body as he turned, then into his back as he fled. Witnesses heard fragments of their argument, words about sex, desperation, dominance, the chilling plea, "Pull my pants down, take your hand off the gun," made the case darker than anyone could have anticipated. When the Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over, the evidence told a fragmented story but not a definitive one. Missing body camera footage left critical gaps. Cheryl's history of complaints raised eyebrows, but none had ever led to discipline. And so, prosecutors turned their focus, not on her, but on him. Within days, Cleve was the one facing charges: aggravated assault, battery, attempting to disarm an officer. The woman who fired 8 bullets walked away without charges. For Cleve, survival was both a blessing and a curse. He lived through the bullets, but his body was forever changed. Paralysis weakened his left arm. Chronic pain gnawed at him daily, and his mounting medical bills dwarfed his meager means. Still, instead of returning home to heal, he was booked into custody, held on a $200,000 bond he couldn't dream of affording. In the eyes of the system, he was not a victim. He was the criminal once again. For Cheryl, the system offered protection. Marta placed her on paid administrative leave, her $68,000 salary still arriving as she stayed home. The public wondered what policy she had violated when she was quietly terminated in March 2024, but the department never disclosed details. The silence was deafening, the accountability absent. This case was not an isolated story. Studies show that police officers are 4 times more likely than civilians to use violence in personal relationships. Yet, prosecutions are rare, convictions rarer still. The reasonable belief standard in Georgia means if an officer claims to fear for their life, it's almost always enough to justify deadly force. Cheryl's badge became her shield, her credibility overwhelming the broken body of a man with a record. But peel back the uniforms and the files, and the tragedy remains deeply human. 2 flawed people bound together by secrecy, desire, and power. One sought love and stability, the other control and validation. Their relationship existed in a liminal space, hidden but consuming, tender but toxic. And when power and fear finally collided, the outcome was written in blood. The haunting question lingers. Was this truly self-defense? Or was it the final act of a relationship where love turned into obsession and authority morphed into violence? What does it mean when the very people sworn to protect us use their badges to shield their own private wars? And perhaps most haunting of all, if Cleve had never loved Cheryl, never trusted her, never let her into his life, would he be free today instead of trapped once again, this time in a cage built by bullets and betrayal? There is more missing evidence, silenced witnesses, a trail of complaints that never saw daylight. But the deeper we go, the darker it becomes. And you'll want to hear it all, because the Cheryl Clark case is not just about one officer and one man. It is about the thin line between love and violence, protection and abuse, justice and corruption. And once you see that line blur, you can never unsee it. When the Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over Cheryl Clark's case, the first step was routine. Secure the evidence. Ballistics, dispatch logs, and body-worn camera footage. On paper, it should have been straightforward. An officer discharges her weapon. The review begins. Facts are cross-checked, and a conclusion is drawn. But this was no ordinary case, and almost immediately, details began to slip through cracks that seemed less like coincidence and more like design. The first red flag was the body camera. MARTA policy was unambiguous. Officers must activate their cameras during any public encounter, and absolutely without exception during a use of force. According to the internal report, Clark's camera had been activated, but when investigators checked the recordings, what they found was incomplete. Fragments of sound, without the full sequence of video that should have existed. Some claimed it was a malfunction. Others whispered it was deliberate tampering. The most haunting detail? Cheryl had been disciplined in the past for improper camera use, yet no permanent record of that had ever been attached to her file. Now, with Cleve shot and paralyzed, the missing footage was the only piece that could have stripped away the layers of conflicting testimony. Without it, the truth remained buried in shadows. Ballistics painted their own murky picture. 8 bullets fired, 2 gouged into the asphalt at Cleve's feet, a warning or perhaps the beginning of panic. 3 tore into him as he turned his body, as if trying to escape, not attack. And the last 3 entered his back, angled downward, suggesting he was already falling, already crouched, already defeated. If Cheryl had truly feared for her life in those final seconds, why did her weapon keep firing into a man who was moving away? Witnesses could have answered that, but strangely, few were ever called. A MARTA employee reported hearing an argument before the gunshots, a tense exchange laced with profanity and a chilling command about pulling pants down. Another recalled seeing Cleve approach the patrol car with his hands empty. Yet in the official narrative, these voices faded away, deemed unreliable or irrelevant. Then came the silence around Cheryl's past. Internal affairs records revealed 3 prior complaints against her. 2 accused her of excessive force during arrests, and 1 came from an ex-boyfriend in 2019 who alleged harassment after their breakup. None resulted in disciplinary action. None were admitted into court filings. They vanished as if they had never existed. The shield of the badge was powerful, and in Cheryl's case, nearly impenetrable. As the investigation dragged on, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. No charges would be filed against Sergeant Clark. Instead, Cleve would face trial for aggravated assault, battery, and attempting to disarm an officer. The very man who had been shot 8 times, who now lay in a hospital bed with permanent damage, was rebranded as the aggressor. His mugshot, not hers, filled the evening news. The narrative was rewritten. An ex-con who attacked an officer forced to fire, but behind closed doors, even some investigators admitted unease. One forensic examiner confided off-record that the shooting pattern looked more like suppression than self-defense. A MARTA supervisor noted Cheryl had grown increasingly erratic in the months before the incident, requesting night shifts and spending unusual amounts of time off patrol. Yet these murmurs never found their way into the official storyline. Meanwhile, Cheryl stayed home on paid leave. $68,000 a year. Every paycheck on time, while Cleve's medical bills mounted past $400,000. His family begged for help, raising small donations through church fundraisers, but the costs dwarfed their efforts. Every day he woke with pain burning down his left arm, a constant reminder of what had been taken. He was no longer a man rebuilding a life, he was once again a prisoner, this time shackled by debt, disability, and the weight of an accusation he couldn't shake. By March 2024, Marta quietly terminated Cheryl Clark. The official reason? Violation of department policy. But when pressed, officials refused to clarify which policy had been broken. Was it camera protocol, abuse of authority, misuse of force, or something darker? The vagueness served its purpose. It closed the chapter without ever addressing the heart of the story. And yet, this was bigger than Cheryl and Cleve. The Department of Justice has documented that nearly 40% of law enforcement officers admit to using violence in their intimate relationships, a figure 4 times the national average. In case after case, the pattern looks eerily similar. A secret relationship, escalating control, a staged confrontation that provides cover under the cloak of self-defense. Since 2020, there have been 17 documented cases of officers using their badge to stalk or harm a partner. In 15 of those cases, the officer's story became the official truth. Convictions? Just 2. The Cheryl Clark case fit neatly into this troubling pattern. A hidden affair. A man with a record, easy to discredit. An officer with a badge, trained to frame her fear as justification, and a justice system primed to take her word over his, no matter the scars etched across his body. Still, there are questions no ruling can erase. Why did Cheryl insist Cleve park under the broken streetlight? Why did the body camera malfunction at the exact moment it was needed most? Why were the witnesses silenced, the complaints erased, the evidence framed to tell only one side? Perhaps the most chilling question. If Cleve had died that night, would his name have been forgotten altogether? Another faceless suspect in a fleeting news cycle, his story buried beneath the credibility of a uniform? The case leaves us unsettled because it exposes the fragile boundary between authority and abuse, between love and control, between justice and the machinery that too often protects its own. And it forces us to confront a reality no one wants to admit. Sometimes the greatest danger does not come from the criminals we fear, but from those we are told to trust. To understand how a decorated police sergeant became the center of one of Atlanta's most disturbing scandals, you have to step inside Cheryl Clark's world, not the one polished in commendations and awards, but the one she kept hidden, the side few dared to talk about. On the surface, Clark was the embodiment of discipline, 15 years in uniform, rising through the MARTA police ranks, volunteering for the toughest assignments. She had the look of authority, the stride of someone who had survived the unforgiving rhythm of crime-ridden train stations. But beneath the layers of uniform and badge was a woman whose private life was spiraling. Friends recall her as fiercely independent, someone who did not easily let people in. She carried herself like steel, but in relationships, she was intense, possessive, and often volatile. That intensity could be intoxicating at first. Flattering, even her attention felt like the center of the universe. But for those who knew her longer, it quickly became suffocating. An ex-boyfriend in 2019 filed a complaint accusing her of harassment when their relationship ended. He claimed she wouldn't stop showing up at his workplace, sending late-night texts, using her position to intimidate. The department noted the complaint, investigated briefly, then closed it without action. It became just another paper in a drawer, forgotten until now. Inside the department, whispers about Cheryl's temper circulated quietly. Some officers joked she was married to the job. Others avoided patrols with her, claiming she escalated situations unnecessarily. There were complaints of excessive force, grabbing a suspect harder than protocol allowed, drawing her weapon faster than a situation required. None stuck. Each one ended with "not sustained" stamped across the report. And so, Cheryl Clark's record remained officially clean, her reputation intact, her authority unquestioned. But authority without accountability is dangerous. For Cheryl, the badge didn't just protect her on the streets, it shielded her private behavior, gave her cover in the moments when personal and professional blurred. When she met Cleve Lambert, she didn't meet him as Sergeant Clark. She met him as Cheryl, a woman who had grown accustomed to control. And when Cleve pushed back, when he refused to play by her rules, she responded the only way she knew how, with power. The psychology of power in relationships, especially those involving authority figures, is often subtle at first. Small demands become larger. Moments of vulnerability get turned into leverage. For Cleve, who was struggling to rebuild after prison, Cheryl's presence was both a lifeline and a trap. She had resources, stability, and the credibility he lacked. She also had a volatile need for validation, a demand for intimacy that often crossed boundaries. When he resisted, she pressed harder. When he avoided her, she found ways to pull him back. To leave her wasn't just to risk losing a lover, it was to risk the wrath of someone with institutional power. By late 2022, Cleve began pulling away. He avoided 5 Point Station, added detours to his commute, kept excuses ready for why he couldn't meet. But Cheryl was not the kind of person who tolerated distance. She had transferred to 5 Points deliberately, perhaps to keep him within her orbit. When she demanded money, sex, or time, Cleve faced an impossible choice: comply, or anger a woman who wore a badge and carried a Glock. That night in January, when she told him to park under the broken light, the scene was already charged with her need for control. The haunting audio, her demanding he pull her pants down while her hand remained on her weapon, was not just a grotesque fusion of intimacy and violence. It was the clearest glimpse into her psychology. For Cheryl, the personal and professional had fused into something toxic. Desire became domination. Rejection became provocation. And when Cleve resisted, she reached for the only language she fully trusted: the language of force. Experts who study law enforcement and domestic abuse say this kind of dynamic is tragically common. Officers, trained to assert authority on the streets, sometimes carry that same dominance into their private lives. Studies reveal that police officers are significantly more likely than civilians to use violence against their intimate partners. Yet these cases rarely see consequences, shielded by a culture of silence and an unspoken rule: protect your own. Cheryl fit the pattern. She knew how to frame a narrative, how to turn an intimate dispute into a story of fear and self-defense. She had watched it happen before, with other officers, and she knew the law's language well. I feared for my life. Those 5 words, spoken from the mouth of an officer, could turn nearly any shooting into a justified one. And so, even as Cleve bled and his body betrayed him, Cheryl's words carried more weight than his wounds. What's striking is not just how Cheryl's story overshadowed his, but how the system allowed it. Missing footage was never recovered. Prior complaints vanished from official reports. Witnesses were dismissed, and Cheryl, instead of being interrogated with the scrutiny faced by civilians, was shielded by her department. Left at home on paid leave, her gun quietly confiscated while her paycheck kept flowing. In March 2024, when MARTA finally terminated her, the decision was cloaked in silence. They cited violation of policy, but refused to name which one. It was a bureaucratic curtain, closing the chapter without ever answering the deeper questions. Was it the missing footage? The inappropriate relationship? The misuse of force? Or all of the above? For Cheryl, the consequences were financial and professional. Her career ended, her salary gone. For Cleve, the consequences were existential, his body half paralyzed, his medical bills insurmountable, his reputation shredded by charges he could not afford to fight. One was free to rebuild in silence. The other remained in custody, unable to post bond, waiting for a trial that would determine the rest of his life. At the center of it all is the haunting portrait of Cheryl Clark herself, a woman who built her career on authority, who craved intimacy but twisted it into control, who used her badge as both shield and weapon. To her colleagues, she was a cop with commendations. To Cleve, she was a lover turned predator. To the public, she is now a symbol of how power can corrupt even the most trusted roles. But here's the most chilling part. Cheryl Clark is not unique. Her story is one of many. Across the country, officers entangled in toxic relationships have turned their training, their authority, and their weapons against the very people closest to them. And time after time, the system bends to protect them. The deeper we go, the more haunting the questions become. How many Cheryl Clarks are still wearing uniforms tonight? How many Cleves are out there, silenced by the weight of a badge, left to carry scars that no courtroom ever acknowledges? This isn't just a case of one officer and one man. It's a window into a hidden epidemic where the lines between love, power, and violence blur, and where justice becomes just another casualty. By the time Cleve Lambert was stable enough to leave the hospital, his body was a patchwork of scars, metal pins, and permanent damage. His left arm hung limp, never regaining full strength. Pain became his constant companion. But instead of returning to his family's care, instead of beginning the long road to rehabilitation, Cleve was transferred in shackles to Fulton County Jail. His new reality was not that of a victim, but of a defendant. The district attorney's office wasted no time in announcing charges: aggravated assault on a police officer, battery, and attempting to disarm an officer. Each one carried decades of potential prison time. To the public, the narrative was familiar and convenient. An ex-convict who had attacked a veteran sergeant, forcing her to shoot. In press conferences, officials leaned heavily on Cheryl Clark's uniform. Based on the evidence, they said, we cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt that her use of force was unlawful. The badge was her shield once again, and her story became the accepted truth. Inside the courtroom, however, the contradictions were glaring. Prosecutors presented Cheryl as the victim of a violent ex-lover. They showed photographs of her bruised arm, her bloodied nose, the scratches on her uniform. They argued that Cleve had struck first, dragging her to the ground, clawing for her service weapon. Their star witness was Cheryl herself, recounting her fear, her split-second decision, and her claim that she had no choice but to fire. But when Cleve's public defender tried to introduce evidence to counter her story, the barriers rose high. Ballistics that showed shots entering his back were ruled as consistent with him turning during a struggle. Witnesses who heard Cheryl demanding sexual acts before the gunfire were dismissed as unreliable. And the missing body camera footage, what should have been the most important evidence of all, was explained away as a malfunction. The defense argued that Cleve had walked into a trap. He had been told exactly where to park, under a broken light. His hands were empty when he approached. The first bullets hit the ground at his feet, not during a close struggle, and the final 3 bullets tore into him as he fled. They painted Cheryl as a scorned lover, enraged by rejection, using her badge and her weapon to settle a private score. But for a jury conditioned to trust police testimony over the word of a man with a criminal record, the argument was an uphill battle from the start. Cleve himself testified. He spoke softly, haltingly, his voice cracking as he described their relationship. How she had once been tender, supportive, even protective. How that affection shifted into demands he could not always meet. How she grew possessive, jealous, and increasingly erratic. He admitted their relationship was complicated, filled with secrets and arguments, but insisted he never tried to take her gun, never tried to hurt her. "I just wanted to get the money she owed me," he told the court. "I didn't want no trouble. I didn't want to die." The courtroom grew tense when the defense replayed the haunting audio, the commands about pants, the desperate plea for her to take her hand off the gun. For a moment, the veneer of self-defense cracked. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some casting glances at Cheryl as if seeing her for the first time not as an officer, but as a woman consumed by something darker. But prosecutors swiftly reframed it. They argued the words were part of a chaotic struggle, an attempt by Cleve to manipulate her, a taunt in the heat of violence. And so the trial became less about evidence and more about credibility. On one side, a decorated officer, her record sanitized by years of dismissed complaints, her uniform carrying the weight of institutional respect. On the other, a man fresh out of prison, struggling to rebuild, his past dragged out like a chain around his neck. Every time the defense pointed to inconsistencies, the prosecution countered with his criminal history. Every time the defense suggested misconduct, the prosecution reminded jurors of his time behind bars. In the end, the case was less about what happened that night and more about who the jury believed was capable of violence. But behind the scenes, whispers persisted. Investigators knew the ballistics told a different story. Supervisors knew Cheryl's disciplinary record was not as clean as the courtroom suggested, and yet, none of it surfaced in a way that mattered. Internal affairs remained silent. The department's own failures to discipline her were hidden behind confidentiality laws, and so, the trial continued on rails laid down long before the first shot was fired. For Cleve's family, the trial was agony. His mother sat in the front row, clutching a Bible, her face etched with disbelief. "My son ain't perfect," she told reporters outside. "But he didn't deserve to be shot down like a dog. He didn't deserve this." His sister spoke about how he had been trying job applications, dishwashing shifts, money sent home despite meager wages. He was doing everything right, she said, and still it wasn't enough. For Cheryl, The trial was a performance she knew well. Calm on the stand, precise in her language, invoking training, protocol, and the ever-present refrain, "I feared for my life." It was a phrase designed to end debates, to override doubt, to place her actions firmly within the acceptable boundaries of police work. And for many jurors, it was enough. The verdict didn't come quickly. The jury deliberated for days, torn between two conflicting realities. On one hand, the evidence of excessive force was impossible to ignore. On the other, the law's broad protection of police self-defense gave them little room to convict her. In the end, it was Cleve who bore the brunt. Though Cheryl avoided criminal charges entirely, he remained in custody, his fate uncertain, his trial a reminder that in conflicts between badges and civilians, the scales are rarely balanced. And so, the case of Cheryl Clark and Cleve Lambert was not just about two people. It was about a system that stacked the deck long before the first juror was seated. A system that believes uniforms more than it believes scars. A system where the truth can vanish as easily as body camera footage, leaving behind only the official story. But the deeper tragedy is not only what happened that night, or even what happened in court. It's what the case reveals about power itself. How love, control, and violence can intertwine. How institutions can protect those who wear their symbols while abandoning those who don't. How a man's attempt to rebuild his life can be undone in a single night, not just by bullets, but by the machinery of justice that insists on seeing him as a threat rather than a survivor. The haunting question now lingers. When justice depends not on facts but on uniforms, what hope is there for those on the other side of the badge? The story of Cheryl Clark and Cleve Lambert did not end in a courtroom, nor in the parking lot where 8 bullets found their mark. It continues in the lives shattered, in the questions that refuse to be answered, and in the broader shadow it casts over the idea of justice itself. To understand why this case lingers, you have to step beyond the individuals and see the system that made such an outcome possible. In America, police officers hold extraordinary power. They are armed, trained, and entrusted with the authority to protect and serve. But that same authority can just as easily be turned inward against partners, lovers, and family members when the line between professional duty and personal desire collapses. A Department of Justice study revealed a chilling truth. Nearly 40% of police officers admit to using physical violence in their intimate relationships. That's 4 times the national average. Yet when officers cross this line, the consequences are rare, the punishments light, and the silence deafening. Cheryl Clark was not the first officer to use her badge as a shield in a personal dispute. Since 2020, at least 17 similar cases have been documented nationwide. Officers who lured partners into confrontations, framed encounters as self-defense, and relied on their credibility to erase suspicion. In 15 of those cases, the official narrative favored the officer. Convictions? Only 2. The pattern is undeniable and terrifying. Cleve's story fits the mold with cruel precision. A man with a record, easy to discredit. A woman with a badge, armed not only with a gun but with the weight of institutional trust. The bullets were only part of his punishment. The rest came afterward. The charges that painted him as an aggressor. The bond set far beyond his means. The endless medical bills that dwarfed his family's ability to help. He survived the shooting, but survival was hardly freedom. He now lives in a limbo of confinement, pain etched into his body, waiting for a trial that may never see the full truth. And Cheryl? She was placed on leave with pay for over a year, her salary steady, while Cleve's life unraveled. Eventually, she was terminated. But even then, the reason was vague. Violation of policy. No criminal charges, no public reckoning. Just silence, and a file closed behind the locked doors of bureaucracy. The badge had done its job, not to protect the public, but to protect its own. The tragedy of this case is not only that Cheryl Clark pulled the trigger, it is that the system allowed her story to eclipse his. Evidence disappeared, complaints were erased, and witnesses ignored. What should have been a complex investigation into abuse of power became instead a tidy justification for the officer and a second punishment for the man she had already left paralyzed. But the Cheryl Clark case is more than a local scandal. It forces us to confront a question that cuts deep into the heart of justice itself. What happens when the very people sworn to protect us become the threat? When uniforms are not shields but disguises, when body cameras go dark at the worst moments, when the presumption of honesty favors the powerful over the wounded, the moral weight of this story rests not only on Cheryl's shoulders, but on ours. As a society, we must decide whether a badge should continue to serve as a blank check for violence, or whether accountability should apply to everyone equally. We must ask why police departments can close complaints without consequence, why prosecutors bend toward officers while pressing harder against those they wound, and why families like Cleve's are left to fight uphill battles against institutions designed to silence them. For Cleve, the question is personal. Every day he wakes to a body that doesn't work the way it once did, to a life put on hold, to a name dragged through mud. For Cheryl, the question is quieter, buried under the anonymity of dismissal. She walks free, her gun taken but her liberty intact, her side of the story still accepted by many. For the rest of us, the question is haunting. How many more Cheryl Clarks are out there tonight, and how many more Cleves will pay the price before something changes? In the end, this story is not only about love turned violent, or power turned abusive. It is about the fragile boundary between justice and corruption, about the silence that protects authority, and about the voices like Cleves that get buried under the weight of a badge. And so, the Cheryl Clark case leaves us with a final, unsettling truth. Sometimes, the greatest danger is not the stranger lurking in the shadows, but the person in uniform, the one we are told to trust, the one who carries both the law and a weapon in the same hand. What would you do if the one meant to protect you became the one who destroyed you? When serve and protect becomes stalk and control, when the line between justice and violence blurs so completely that you can no longer tell the difference? There is no neat ending here, no justice neatly served, only scars, silence, and the chilling reminder that power, once corrupted, leaves a wound that never fully heals. If stories like this matter to you, stories the mainstream rarely tells, subscribe now, because the next case we cover may leave you even more unsettled, and the truth may be closer to home than you think.